As you may have guessed, I am basically going over the playlist for September 2016, the things which relate to PhpStorm. In this particular video, I'm going to recall a few key facts about how the PHP interpreter is configured so that when I debug a PHP script as a command line script, PhpStorm will be able to use the CLI version of the PHP interpreter on the virtual machine, rather than use any interpreter on my Mac. Of course, there's also another way of debugging which doesn't use the command line interface for PHP. It uses the Apache configuration, and that's something different, but that's not what I'm going to talk about right now. I'm going to press Command and comma to get the preferences, and then I'll go to the PHP preferences. Under Languages and Frameworks, I'll click on PHP. So here you can see that the configuration in the preferences is set up so that the language version 7 of PHP and the interpreter is the remote PHP 7 interpreter. To dig in deeper, I believe I would have to click here. Okay, and then I get this dialog box. Okay, I'm going to move this one out of the way. So now we're dealing with this dialog box. This configuration is called CLI interpreters. And I have one set up, and it's called remote PHP 7. So what you're looking at over here is how I configured remote PHP 7, which is the CLI interpreter for this project. I'm using the deployment configuration. Remember in the previous video, I talked about deployment configurations. Okay, the deployment configuration basically was the SSH sandbox configuration, which allowed me to be able to navigate the virtual machine's directory system. Okay, so here I'm specifying SSH sandbox as the deployment configuration, and down here I'm specifying the path to the executable on the virtual machine, and it retrieved certain information about that executable, including its configuration file and which debugger it is using. If you want to see the actual steps that I took in order to add the CLI interpreter called Remote PHP 7, watch the video that corresponds to this video in the September 2017 playlist. One thing to keep in mind is there are two ways of debugging a script in my project. One is to use the command line interface interpreter, and the other one is to use the PHP that runs in the web server. Those are two different pieces of PHP code. Okay, PHP has two interpreters, one for the command line and one for the web server. Okay, so in this video, we're just talking about the interpreter that we will use when we are debugging our script as a command line script. By the way, when I upgraded to PHP 7 on my production server, I also had to install a newer version of Xdebug, so you may want to go and look for those, and that may be in the playlist that I made. I think it was the month or a couple of months before my September 2016 playlist. I'm going to close this window here and bring this one back, and I want to point out one thing. Path mappings. Remember, we're in the PHP configuration. We've configured the language, which is PHP 7. We configured the interpreter for the command line interface. And over here, if we press this button over here, let me actually press it. The path mappings tell PhpStorm how to map a local path on my Mac to a remote path, which means on the virtual machine. Okay, and it separates them into two categories, the general ones and then the ones that are for deployment configuration. And I can see that there's a problem here because it's mapping the the project root to the includes directory on the remote path, and that doesn't look right to me. So I'm going to pause the video and try to fix this. Actually, when I click here, see here it says includes, and then when I click here, it does show that this goes all the way to the includes. It's just that it's so long that it doesn't show it. So this is correct. So basically, this is the mapping for the includes folder, and this is the mapping for the project folder. Okay, I'm going to hit cancel. Okay, so that's path mappings. I'm going to emphasize something which I may have already mentioned. Okay, let's open the CLI Interpreter Dialog. See here where it says deployment configuration? That's what we use to populate some of the things in this dialog box. And it was called SSH Sandbox. That's the deployment configuration. So I'm going to show you where that deployment configuration is. Okay, hit cancel. I want Command-Shift-A, and then deployment, and then configuration. Okay, this is SSH Sandbox, which you just saw in the other dialog box. So this has to be configured in order for us to be able to use that over there. And that'll be it for this video. But the video that I'm actually getting this information from the September 2016 playlist, it actually starts talking about configuring the data sources and drivers. Now, data sources and drivers, that's what allows us to be able to use this on the far right side of PhpStorm, this thing called database, all right, which I guess it digs into the database for this project. And this is the MySQL database for the project, which is on the virtual machine. But that'll be in the next video.